Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Courtenay Cabot Venton. She is a consultant, an independent consultant, and she's coming to us live from the UK. She's going to speak for 10 minutes, and then you can ask questions. If you're comfortable, you can come up here so she can see you. We are recording this, so we'll put this in the Google Doc as well, so you have access to it. If you don't want to come up here and ask a question, you can just ask it from your seat, and I will relay it to her. So, Courtenay, take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you all in person. I love any excuse to come to the region, but thanks for including me via the video link. So I'm just going to very briefly run through the findings of a study that I did with USAID last year on the economics of resilience. We released it in January. I know a few of you in the room have already seen this, so apologies, but hopefully it'll be new to most of you. And just a shout out to Mark Lawrence, who I did this with, who works at the Food Economy Group. The aim of the overall study was to compare the costs, avoided losses, and benefits of four scenarios. So we looked at a late humanitarian response, an early humanitarian response, safety net plus the early humanitarian response, and then a resilience scenario. So we were trying to look at how costs and avoided losses progress over different types of response. And we modeled this for 15 million people across 54 livelihood zones in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And just to give you a sense of our theory of change, the idea was that if we were able to respond earlier and with greater resilience building measures, that there would be direct cost savings for donors. Food deficits at a household level would be smaller, which reduces the humanitarian cost. We'd avoid negative coping strategies, avoid losses, and this would create this virtual circle. Also, just to give you a quick headline, we had three estimates that we presented. The total net cost adjusted, which is adjusting for the transfer amount that's additional to household deficits. I know I'm running through these quickly, but we can address any questions in after this. And the total net cost with benefits. And the key findings were that investing in resilience building would save upwards of $4.3 billion over a 15-year period, with a benefit to cost ratio of 2.8 to 1. I would also highlight that benefit to cost ratio is actually additional to, that's purely the benefits in relation to the costs of an earlier humanitarian response. It's additional to any benefits that may arise through investing in resilience measures outside of the humanitarian response. So they were pretty impressive findings. Also, just to put that in context, the US government spent $5.4 billion in the 3 country studies over the last 15 years. So the 30% cost savings estimated in this study would be equivalent to savings of $1.6 billion when applied to US government spending. When we consider that the USG spends $6.3 billion on humanitarian each year globally, the savings would obviously be very significant. And clearly, there's also strong messaging around early response. So this isn't just about investing in resilience, it's also about ensuring that we complement that with early response to humanitarian crises, which I know was pretty key in Somalia in 2016. This is a map just to give you a quick idea of where we did the analysis. And just a little more information, I'm going to run over these very quickly because we don't have much time, but I wanted to include them in here so that you have reference to them around the HEA model that we use to underpin the analysis. It's a livelihoods-based framework where we were able to take data across these 54 livelihood zones and create a 15-year model that allowed us to predict how different shocks and stresses would affect household economies and what the humanitarian caseload would be as a result. So we compared a baseline made up of all different forms of income with a survival threshold and a livelihoods protection threshold, the amount of money that people would need to ensure that they could maintain their household income. We then looked at a hazard scenario to see how that household income would be affected. And then looked at, once we'd integrated coping mechanisms through different response scenarios, how that would change the deficit level in each household. And this just gives you a quick idea of what the model looks like on it over 15 years, where you can see bad years and good years. And then we combined this into an economic model, which allowed us to calculate the cost each year of different scenarios. So just a couple of messages that came out of this study. First of all, a mix of production and consumption support is required. It shows you a Turkana pastoral versus a Turkana agro-pastoral, where you can see the really big difference between households in the pastoral area who are almost never able to meet their livelihoods protection threshold, whereas in agro-pastoral area where you can see that there's a little bit more potential. And the blue bar that I just added in is showing you when we layer in a safety net, how we're able to lift people above livelihoods protection threshold. The red bar shows you where people are able to save with that safety net transfer, where they sort of tip over into enough to have some households, and how we're able to make a little bit more of a difference for pastoral households as compared to the pastoral households. Analysis looked at, this is an example Somalia of agro-pastoral poor households. We did a little experiment because we wanted to look at not only what it cost to look at safety net transfers every year, also what would it cost us to actually graduate households. If we gave households a one-off investment fund in year one and assumed that it yields 30% income per year, how long would it take us to reach a point where households can fill their deficits that are no longer reliant on a safety net transfer? And what's really interesting about this comparison, the top graph shows you the safety net in the blue with their savings in the red every year. The bottom graph, the yellow, is their investment income. And the blue, again, is the safety net. And you can see that after 3 years, households other than B10 were able to cope on their own with their safety net transfer. So that's a pretty quick graduation scenario. By contrast, we did the same in Tigray, Ethiopia, with poor agricultural households, and you can see that the safety net in that bottom graph has to persist for a very long time in order to allow people to start to reach enough of a level of investment to be able to cope on their own. We also did a really interesting analysis where we looked at the disaster that a really interesting set of data from HEA baselines from 2006 and from 2016. And we were able to see that there were no, compared, the baselines were conducted with the same population, the same questions, so a great longitudinal analysis. And we could see that when you compared those 2 years, that there were no notable changes in crop yields. They'd increased very significantly, but no change in household status. And the reason that happened is because land holdings had decreased by such a lot that the increases in yield no longer had the effect of elevating household status. But we wanted to model the fact that this was the disaster that never happened. So what would have happened if we hadn't made that investment in the agriculture? So we recreated the model for the last 15 years, one looking without improved agricultural production and what household deficit would look like, and in the second, comparing that with improvements. And we were able to estimate that we saved over 1,000 per household from aid costs alone, which is really important for showing sometimes our investments may not be immediately obvious, but are actually making a big difference. Great, thank you. So the policy applications, investment in resilience is more cost effective than providing ongoing humanitarian assistance. Safety net and resilience building are critical, but they need to be complemented by an early response. And triggers for early response need to be based on a comprehensive seasonal assessment. So we found that the triggers were not just based on rainfall data or just price data. A sort of combination of factors was affecting when people had a drop in their household economy. Both consumption support and investment in productive activities are needed, but this differs heavily depending on context. Requires a tailored approach. And adaptive management approaches that can respond to the particular context and changing circumstances of households should help to realize outcomes most effectively. I think this is really important in terms of thinking through the fact that building people's resilience through a safety net transfer isn't just about reaching a certain threshold. It changes every year. So how do we make sure that we're adaptive? And last slide, food for thought. These findings are really relevant for slow and onset protracted crises. How could we apply these in other contexts and countries? Something that's come up quite a lot recently is how could we translate these findings across to a refugee context? A lot of that thinking came out of the Somalia study, and we're just looking at doing that with USAID and DFID, and then further thinking about how this would manifest in the system as a whole, given the amount of money we spend on humanitarian assistance every year. So that's the study in a super nutshell. I'd love to hear any of your questions.
Any comments, questions? Feel free to ask from your seat if you want to come up here. They're all looking deep in thought.
That was like the most rapid version I've done of that in my life, so apologies.
And
I've overwhelmed everybody.
That PowerPoint is already in the Learning Resource portal, so it's there for you to look at. Any comments, questions, any surprises? Courtney, can you put up the last slide again, please?
Yeah.
Yes, for that.
Hang on, share screen.
And just a reminder, we are recording this, so you can go back and take a look at it.
There we go.
Did you have a question or comment? The one before this one? Can you do the second to last one, please? Courtney, can you clarify the first point? Do you mean safety net plus?
Yeah, so I think that really came out of those analyses where we looked at the potential for consumption support through a safety net transfer, but then the productive potential through an investment fund, trying to play around with different scenarios. And it was really clear, for instance, in that T. Gray analysis, that you couldn't, even if you invested in an investment fund that was yielding a relatively good return, you couldn't just drop off the consumption. It was still a 10-year commitment through the safety net transfer to make sure that people could still meet their consumption needs. So really trying to understand the interaction between those two, and also based on the specific context, what can be used where is really critical.
Yes.
So my question is, the Somali example, Somalia was where did that
Courtney, can you hear her? No, sorry.
Hi, Courtney.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. So for Somalia and Tigray, the differences was quite surprising. So first of all, Somalia, which data were you using? Was it FSNU data or your own data? And which,
so I think some of it came from FSNE. It's the HEA baseline data, which comes from a whole host of organizations, USGS, Save the Children, but I can't remember which one per country. I could look it up. But this was for North Somalia, which is why it came out more positive.
Okay. I was wondering which parts of Somalia. So do you know which parts of North?
I think this was Baybak-Hole, but I'd have to look it up. I think it's the same, as...
And so what do you think contributed to households being able to graduate in the 3-year period in Somalia, as opposed to when you consider that in Tigray, you have so many government investments, the PSNP has been there for so many years. I'm just really quite surprised. What was the factor?
Yeah, so that's a really good question and really good point, because it was one of the key things that came out of this study, is that the reason that this was such high potential is because when it was a bad year, it was really bad, but when it was a good year, it was actually pretty good. So you can see in the graph that I have up right now that in the good years, the investment actually contributed to quite a bit more savings, because they could actually really leverage the investment money to then have some savings to then cope with the bad year. By contrast, let me just jump down to this one. By contrast, in Tigray, every year was terrible. So for them to get enough above their consumption threshold to be able to invest in something that allowed them to actually have savings that spilled over was just a much harder scenario. And so it actually really speaks to this idea that investing in good years is probably fundamental to, I have this down at the bottom of this slide, to allow savings for bad years, and really starts to get at that issue around the humanitarian development nexus and how we can bring those two communities of practice closer together, because that was what drove the ability of those households. And as I say, it was North Somalia, so it's a slightly different scenario to Southern Somalia, but it really highlighted how important that issue is.
And Tigray was agricultural areas, correct?
Tigray was agricultural poor households. Yeah, this was, I picked one of the worst areas to really highlight how in this context, it's very hard to see how people can.
Northern Somalia was pastoral.
Agro-pastoral.
No, she said Northern Somalia. Oh, it's by Bakal. Okay, so we're comparing like with like. Okay.
Yes, I hope so.
Okay.
No problem.
So that's our time, but again, no, the recordings are going to be up on the Google Docs, so let's give Courtney a hand. Thank you so much. Pardon me.
No problem. Thanks, everybody.
I'm going to stop the recording here.